So who am I? Daniel already gave a short introduction, but indeed I'm an economist working at the European Commission in DG GROW in the REACH unit. And we are working exclusively on the REACH regulation, which is a cornerstone piece of legislation when it comes to chemical legislation in the EU. And I think many of you are probably familiar with REACH, but some of you may not. So I will also give a little bit of context to REACH and what it is. And just to say that REACH is a co-shared responsibility. So I'm working in the Directorate General for Internal Market, and we are working very closely with our colleagues in Directorate General for Environment. And I'm never working alone. Me as an economist, I always work in a team with my technical and legal colleagues. So also for the questions, if there are certain questions more of a technical legal nature, I might not be as well equipped to answer to them, but I will do my very best. So what is REACH? So REACH stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. And it was entered into force in 2007, and it has 4 main objectives that can be good to repeat. So first of all, to ensure a high level of protection of human health and environment. But we also work to promote alternative methods for the assessment of hazardous substances. And this means that we would like to move away from animal testing to non-animal testing methods for all these chemicals that companies need to submit dossiers. We would prefer not to use animals as much as possible. It's also one of the objectives to have the free circulation of substances on the EU internal market. And we work also towards enhancing the competitiveness and innovation of, especially of the EU industry. And this regulation, it applies to all chemical substances, not just those used in industrial processes. So if you think about everyday products like cleaning products and paints, but also articles such as your clothes or furniture at home. And considering this, you can also imagine that almost all companies are either directly or indirectly affected by the REACH regulation. And what is particular with the regulation, I would say, is that the burden of proof is on the companies, that they must identify and manage the risk of substances that they manufacture and they place on the market in the EU. And they need to demonstrate how these substances can be used safely and communicate this to the users. And if risks, they cannot be managed, we as authorities, together with the national authorities, can restrict the use of substances. And we have 2 possibilities, which is in the authorization and the restriction title. So either restrict a specific substance or a specific use of a substance, or when it comes to authorization, a substance may be banned, and then we can allow for authorizations for a specific use for a certain period of time. And this requires that either that the risk is controlled, or if you can prove as a company that there are no alternatives to your substance and that the socioeconomic benefits, they outweigh the risk. And in the long run, we are, of course, working towards that all hazardous substances should be substituted to less dangerous ones. And going to the presentation today, which is about revising REACH, I just wanted to put everyone in the, let's say, where we are and how we got here. And I will show you the policy cycle that we speak about often in the context of EU policy. So 20 years ago, there was a white paper outlining the future of chemicals policy, which was the future REACH. And it was also subject to an impact assessment in 2003, so the preparation phase. And REACH was subsequently adopted in 2006 and entered into force in 2007. And following the adoption, we had a long implementation phase, considering the wide scope of the regulation. Just to give you an example, registration of substances was done in 3 phases. So in 2010, 13, and 18. And of course, also in other titles of the regulation, there was implementation work that took quite some years. And another feature of the regulation is that there are recurring evaluations. So every 5 years, the regulation should be evaluated. And this has happened twice. And the latest REACH review was in 2018, which concluded that there are weaknesses in the regulation, but no revision was foreseen at that point. But then in 2019, we got a new commission, and the European Green Deal was presented in December 2019, which also outlined that there will be a chemical strategy for sustainability, which we adopted in October last year. And in this, both in the European Green Deal and in the chemical strategy for sustainability, the Commission presented a much higher ambition, both in terms of environmental protection, but I would say also in terms of simplifying the legal framework. And this strategy, it sets the trajectory for where EU chemicals policy will go in the medium to long term. And in the chemical strategy, there was also an announcement that the REACH regulation will be revised in order to achieve the objectives of the strategy. So where are we now? We have gone a full cycle. So we are back to the strategy. So in the preparation phase, and now we are working on the impact assessment in order to have the groundwork prepared for an adoption of a revised REACH. So this is where I will focus my presentation today. And I will focus in particular maybe on the impact assessment on authorization and restriction, which is the field I know a little bit more of the regulation. But I will also cover more briefly problems and policy options related to registration and evaluation. So this is where I will go next. So what would we like to address with this REACH revision? So when it comes to the knowledge base, we are often saying that REACH is the most advanced knowledge base globally through the registration of all the substances above 1 ton in the EU. But even though we have the most advanced knowledge base, we realize that there are still gaps, in particular when it comes to some critical hazards related to, for instance, carcinogenicity or endocrine disruption. And the same applies to certain types of substances, such as intermediates or polymers, which are not fully registered, and substances in the lowest tonnage range, because their information requirements in the registration are not as wide as those in higher tonnage bands. And when it comes to combination effects, we know that humans and the environment, that we are exposed to many substances from many different sources. And while you might demonstrate the safe use of one substance, it might not be sufficient against, let's say, unknown combination effects. So this has also been a problem highlighted through the years. We have also realized that the communication that companies need to do up and down the supply chain on the safe use and risk management measures, it lacks a bit of accuracy and clarity. And of course, this has negative impacts on the control of risks because the users are not sufficiently informed, or it might be too complex, the information that they're receiving. And on evaluation, which is done by both the European Chemicals Agency, which is located in Helsinki, and all the national authorities, it has proven to be quite complex. And there are several bottlenecks that might delay requests for information. And of course, if you have delays for request, you also have delays in the conclusions on possible hazards and the following regulatory management measures that you can use. Then moving to authorization, I will spend a bit more time here to outline some of the main problems and weaknesses that we have seen. So for instance, the latest REACH review, it concluded that there is still room for improvement in the authorization, and in particular as regards applications for submitted by upstream operators in the supply chain. And this means that you have one applicant covering many of its downstream users. And I will get back to this a bit later. And the REACH review also showed that in June 2017, there were 43 substances in the Annex 14, which is the authorization list, which was way less than was estimated in the baseline, so in the impact assessment. And they expected around 120 substances by 2016, so quite significant lower amount of substances. And now we have about 54 substances in Annex 14. So experience it has shown that authorization is both heavy for companies and authorities, but also quite inflexible. And I will spend a bit of time of what we mean by this. So just to give you an example, that we have a lot of applications for small quantities of substances. So currently we have about 100 uses that we are processing of a solvent that is used mainly in the pharma industry when it comes to producing vaccines, in vitro diagnostic kits and medicinal products, so things that we are very familiar with at the moment. And these are very low volume applications. Many has even zero emissions, but the procedures that we apply are completely the same. So you might also question, is this the way we should spend our resources in the most efficient way? We have also seen over the years that we have several legal actions against the Commission related to authorizations. So for instance, Sweden took the Commission to court and we lost on almost all points related to especially to the suitability of alternatives and how alternatives were assessed. And we have also been taken to court by NGOs and latest by the European Parliament. And they have criticized the way that we have implemented authorizations. And of course, while the Commission, we could have interpreted and implemented certain elements differently, it's also maybe unclear legal provisions for authorization that has contributed to the difficulties in preparing these authorization decisions. And coming back to the upstream applications, sometimes unclear information in applications have created long delays in the decision making. So for recently, or we are currently also working on applications related to chromium trioxide, which is a substance used for plating surface treated articles. And some of these decisions have taken a very long time, and we are still processing them, although they've been pending for 4 years. So this is not good in terms of workers' protection, not good for the environment, and it's certainly not good for companies that have no predictability of their applications. So clearly not a situation that we would like to be in. And then finally, the last point there is that authorization requirements applies only to uses within the EU. So which means that if a chemical is not present in a final article and there is no risk, we can easily import it from third countries. And of course, this is a clear disadvantage for EU companies that manufacturing can just move outside of the EU, sometimes even to countries that have less control and risk management measures in place, and we simply import it back. So this is something that is also a concern. And moving to restrictions. The latest REACH review concluded that there is also further room for improvement in the restriction process. And although new restrictions, they have been proposed, it has been, let's say, a slower pace than expected. So the review, it suggests that this has been caused by a number of factors. So not just one, but for instance, the lack of information on uses, exposures and risks, but also a quite demanding process that maybe has discouraged member states in particular from proposing restrictions. But to see it on the other side, we see that the number of restrictions has fallen over the years. The restrictions, they have also become much wider in scope. And we are grouping several substances together. So maybe one restriction is covering many substances. And I think this is also showing that by the end of 2020, we did a count of how many substances that we have on the restriction list. And there are more than 8,000 substances in Annex 17 when you count individual CAS numbers. And I think this is something that also should be recognized. And then as a final point on restrictions, it has been clear that professional users are often using the same products as consumers, but they use it, of course, much more frequently and during longer periods of time, but they are unlikely to be as protected as those in industrial settings. So this is also something that we would like to pay more attention to in the future. So what are we going to do to address all these problems that we have identified? So when doing an impact assessment, you always look at different options, and we are currently developing and defining the options that we will include in the impact assessment. And all of these options will be compared against what is called the baseline. And the baseline in our case will be the REACH regulation as it was implemented and stands in April 2021, so this year. And when it comes to registration, so that we would like to update the knowledge base, we will have option to introduce registration of certain polymers, which is in itself a very big action. We're also looking at options to extend the information requirements on uses, including endocrine disruption and carcinogenicity, in order to make sure that we have this information to properly evaluate the substances. And also we will look at whether it will be beneficial to require a chemical safety report for substances at all tonnage levels, which is currently only required for substances above 10 tons. And then when it comes to the combination effects, there will be options to either introduce one generic mixture assessment factor, or whether it would be better to introduce, let's say, different mixture assessment factors for health and the environment, or for different types of hazards, or let's say different groups of substances. So this is also what we will include in the impact assessment. On simplifying communication in the supply chain, we will look at electronic formats that are harmonized, but also how to simplify and make the communication more clear so that it really reaches the users in the most appropriate way. And when it comes to evaluation, procedures will be looked at to be streamlined, also in the framework of something called one substance, one assessment, which will hopefully then speed up the decision making. And there is also one option which would allow ECHA as well as national agencies to commission tests directly in case there is a final ambiguity that needs to be sorted out. And then finally, also the possibility to revoke registrations for non-compliant dossiers, which is not possible today for with the current legal text. And looking at the authorization process, we have, let's say, 3 main options that we will assess. And we will also have a number of sub-options that can go into these options. So we will compare the baseline against the first main option, which would be to keep the authorizations as it is, but of course with the clarifications and simplifications that are needed in order to address the problems that we have encountered. The second option we are looking at is to merge authorizations and restrictions. This would basically mean that you have a restriction, but you can, for that substance, apply for an authorization in order to continue the use under certain circumstances. And the third option is simply to remove the authorization title from REACH, and what is left to the authorities would be restrictions in terms of risk management measures. And what kind of sub-options are we looking at? So I already told you a bit about the problems. So you can imagine that we are looking to clarify certain points. For instance, what do we do when there are changes to granted authorizations? We have increased in volumes, for instance. What are our options there? Also, options to clarify the transitional provisions when we refuse an authorization. So today, basically, if we refuse an authorization, the day after, the use can no longer take place in the EU. There is no possibility for, let's say, a grace period or a phase out of production. We are also looking at to clarify the concept of substitution plan and also the criteria for suitability of alternatives. And also clarifying criteria when these upstreams or the broad applications can be accepted. And as well as simplifying procedures for substances used in smaller quantities, as I mentioned, not to overburden the system. And as a final point, in the chemical strategy for sustainability, it was said that the most hazardous substances should only be used if they are essential for society. So the concept of essential use will also be one option in how to reform the authorization process. So looking at reforming the restriction process, it's, let's say, less significant or less, we have fewer options than the authorization, but we are looking at introducing something called generic bans. So instead of proving an unacceptable risk based on the hazard properties of a substance, they will not be allowed to be used. So they will be restricted, let's say, from a generic risk approach. And this applies especially to consumers because exposure can be very difficult to control. And the hazard properties that we are looking at are, for instance, endocrine disruptors, persistent bioaccumulative and toxic substances, and very persistent and very bioaccumulative substances. And this will be a first step. And then the second step that we will assess is an option to also extend this generic ban for consumers to other hazard classes, such as respiratory sensitizers, immunotoxic, neurotoxic substances. And as I mentioned, one of the problems that we have seen is the protection for professional users. So we would like to extend the protection level also for them. And similar for authorizations, the concept of essential uses will also be an option to be looked at when granting derogations from restrictions. So these are the policy options, or at least some of the policy options that are not fully refined. And then you might think, so how will we pick the most appropriate one? So this we do by looking at the impacts, and we look at, let's say, all significant impacts. And we follow the Commission's better regulation guidelines, which is a toolbox that is publicly available. So anyone can go and see what kind of methodology we are using or should be using when we conduct an impact assessment. And impacts, as much as we can, we try to quantify them and monetize. But they can also be qualified. So in a more qualitative manner, if we do not have enough data to quantify. And we are looking at, of course, impacts on human health and environment from reduced emissions, or we look at also animal testing, if certain impacts or increased information requirements, will it lead to more animal testing? And also we're looking at impacts on achieving a circular economy, on recycling and the safe use of secondary raw materials. And of course, we look at the cost and opportunities for companies with a specific attention to SMEs, because we are very vigilant and we know that REACH is particularly heavy for SMEs to comply with. Because we know that some changes that will be introduced will probably lead to higher costs. For instance, the obligation to register polymers and also the increased information requirements will lead to higher costs for companies. At the same time, we also we know that operators might also benefit from increased transparency or predictability of the system. So this is also something that we are, of course, investigating. And then we look at administrative burden, and this applies both to companies, but also to authorities. We look at the resources and let's say the enforcement. We look at the cost for testing and control and customs, and how this can be, let's say, minimized as much as possible. Because of course we would like a regulation that has a high level of protection and that is good for the free circulation of substance on the internal market, but in the most efficient way possible. And finally, what is our timeline for this impact assessment? So we published the Inception Impact Assessment, which is the sort of a roadmap of where we're going to go in May. And it was open 1 month for public feedback. I am sure that some of you contributed to this consultation. And we received more than 300 responses, actually, which is a very good feedback. And what we are doing right now is to procure a number of external studies that will help us to have a solid evidence base when we are drafting the impact assessment. So I have listed the studies there on the screen, and myself, I'm working in particular on the revision of authorization and restrictions, but I'm also involved in the last study, which is, let's say, the overall impact assessment study. And in these studies, there will be many consultations. So we will have workshops that I hope many of you will participate in. There will also be interviews and targeted surveys. I know, for instance, that the study on endocrine disruptors, they have already launched the targeted survey. So if you are interested to reply to this, if you haven't seen it, let me know and I can also provide you with a link. And another important consultation that is required for all impact assessments is an open public consultation where all citizens and anyone can reply to. And we are aiming towards having this online towards the end of the year. And it will be open for 3 months. And then in the spring, we will basically write the impact assessment and take all the evidence that we collect into consideration in order to then compare these policy options that we have. And we are aiming towards having this impact assessment finalized by next summer. And it's a bit of internal commission cuisine, but we have one important step for us is that we need to submit this impact assessment to the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, which is a a board within the Commission that are scrutinizing all impact assessments and evaluations to ensure that they have a high standard, they have a good methodology, and that the impacts are assessed in the best way possible. And this impact assessment, which will be a staff working document, that's what it's called, is a technical document. It will then accompany the proposal, so the revised REACH proposal that we aim to present at the end of next year, so end of 2022. And this proposal will then be sent to our co-legislators for discussion and adoption, which is then the European Parliament and the European Council. And the first reading is expected to take place in 2023, which is the Swedish presidency that will have the spring term of 2023 if this timeline is respected. So this is more or less what we are working towards. It's an ambitious timeline, but we are working in full speed. So I will stop there, and I will open the floor to questions. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Amie, for this excellent